America is home to 33 million small businesses, the beating heart of communities across the country.
And proof that the American dream is still alive.
This is a show about those dreamers and doers and the communities they serve.
Their real life stories.
Their struggles and successes.
Their grit, determination, and passion.
And the people who fight
to keep their American dream alive.
I'm Alfredo Ortiz.
I'm Elaine Parker.
And it's time for another episode of Main Street Matters,
America's small business megaphone.
Hi, and welcome to another episode of Main Street Matters, America's small business megaphone. I'm Elaine Parker, the president of the Job Creators Network Foundation.
And I'm Jordan Bruno, vice president of Job Creators Network.
Please subscribe to the show at salempodcastnetwork.com or wherever you get your podcast from. Today, we are joined by Bryan Riley. Bryan is the director of National Taxpayers Union Foundation's Free Trade Initiative. His background includes years of research on the impact trade has on people in the United States. He's led grassroots campaigns in support of initiatives like the North American Free Trade Agreement, or NAFTA, and in opposition to special interest efforts to get the government to pick winners and losers in the U.S. economy. He joins us today to discuss former President Donald Trump's tariff proposal. Bryan, welcome to Main Street Matters.
Yeah, thanks for having me on. I appreciate it.
Well, before we get knee deep into tariffs, tell us about the National Taxpayers Union Foundation and what you all do.
Well, thank you. We've been around for over 50 years, and we were established to represent the interests of taxpayers here in Washington, D.C. We felt that every group out there, from farmers to catfish producers to senior citizens, they all have their own group pushing their own agenda, and there's nothing wrong with that. That's the way our economy and our government particularly is supposed to work. And we were set up to just try and be a voice for taxpayers here in D.C. And I joined NTU about 6 years ago. I work on international trade policy, and sometimes people will say, you work at the Taxpayers Union. Why, and you work on trade policy? I don't understand. The reason for that is at the time NTU was concerned that the biggest threat to taxpayers was going to be an increase in tariffs, which are taxes on imports. So they brought me on to help with that. We've had some good successes for taxpayers over the years, and got a lot of risks coming up. But we've had a lot of change with respect to trade policy, where both parties have been willing to impose tariffs, which we think, and I think most economists would agree, are very risky, if not outright costly to Americans.
What is sort of the impact of tariffs? I think a lot of sort of everyday ordinary Americans don't really understand how a tariff impacts them when they go to buy something, go to the store, whatever it is. How is it baked into the things they're buying?
Yeah, I think you're exactly right. Most Americans are busy. We've got things we're worried about. And the tariff on a T-shirt from Guatemala maybe is not high on their list. Now, what is high on their list is how much things cost. And if you look at any surveys, the top concern facing Americans now is the cost of living, inflationary pressures, and that's something where trade policy really plays a role. But historically, what happens with the U.S. and our nation's founding, we relied heavily on tariffs to fund the government. We didn't have income taxes at the time, so we imposed tariffs as a way to raise revenues for the government. Over the last century and a half or so, we transitioned away. We now rely mainly on income taxes, state and local governments, property taxes, and sales taxes. So we don't depend as much on tariffs for revenue. But a lot of times what we use those tariffs for is to try and protect certain industries from competition, or to try and embrace certain foreign policy goals and forward our interests, either through raising barriers or lowering barriers, depending on who's running the show. So if you put a tariff on a product, to get back to your question, if you put a tariff on a product, it's just a tax on an import. So to give you an example, we have about a 15% average tax on clothing. So that drives up the cost for clothing for Americans when we go to our local retailer or buy our clothing online. but that cost, it's not like a sales tax. It doesn't show up on the price tag. So it's just baked in to the final price, as I think you put it. So it drives up costs, but a lot of Americans aren't really even aware
Who's
of the cost.
who is paying the tariff when the good is imported?
Americans pay the tariff. And I say that in two ways. First of all, under U.S. import laws, it spells out that when a foreign good comes in, the responsibility for paying the tariff is from the importer. Whoever is importing that good pays the tariff. Now, economically, the question is, the price goes up. Who is responsible for paying that? Recent research has repeatedly concluded that it's the American consumer and taxpayer who winds up paying those higher prices. Theoretically, the business, if you're a retailer and you import something, you might be able to eat some of those costs because you don't want to pass it along to your customers initially. But in the long term, those prices wind up getting passed along. Theoretically, sometimes the foreign exporter to the United States, they can try and cut their costs to offset the cost of that tariff as well. But when we've looked at what's actually happened over the last 6 or 7 years, when we have seen tariff increases, economists have pretty unanimously agreed that it's the Americans who wind up paying more when they buy the product. And that's a problem at a time of high inflation and high increasing costs of living. I think we ought to be looking to hopefully reduce those costs instead of adding inflationary pressures.
President Trump is proposing a 10% tariff on all imports to the United States. Talk to us about that and what the real world impact that will be.
Well, it costs, various studies have different estimates, but it costs the average household $2,000 to $2,600 a year in higher costs, if we actually went through with that. Now, I think supporters of President Trump would just to try and give them their due, would say he doesn't really mean this. He's using it as a tactic to try and get other countries to adopt policies more to our liking, maybe to bring their tariffs down. I don't think the history shows that hasn't worked out so well in the past. So that 10% tariff would increase costs for Americans. As I just mentioned, American taxpayers are the ones who would pay for it. And I think it would really be a big mistake from the standpoint of what we're going to do about China. We import a lot of goods from China, but we import a lot more of our goods and our imports from Canada and Mexico and Europe and Korea and Japan. These are countries I think we ought to be trying to expand trade with, to give producers an incentive to produce in countries other than China. Now, we want to talk about what country policy we should have with respect to China. That's one thing, but slapping tariffs on our friends and allies who are also large export markets for us, I think is a big mistake, because not only do we pay more, then our trading partners have less money to spend on U.S. exports. And if you're from the Midwest like I am, and you've got soybean farmers or pork producers, if you don't have access to those foreign markets, you're going to have a tough time growing. And that's something that we've learned over the last half dozen years.
Bryan, with nobody making the case for free trade anymore, with both parties turning protectionist, can you just give our listeners and viewers the case for free trade?
Sure. To me, it boils down to something that I hope is pretty straightforward, and it's a question of who makes decisions about how to spend your money. When you get your paycheck, do you get to decide how to spend those dollars, or does somebody in Washington, D.C. get to decide? And I guarantee you, if somebody in D.C. is deciding those choices, they're going to be influenced by which lobbyists have the most clout, who has the most influence, and a lot of things that may or may not be in your best interests as an American. So it's really all about freedom of choice, in my opinion. And when economists look at this, there's a debate over free trade, but literally 95% of economists believe that increases in tariffs, increases in quotas, and other restrictions on imports do more harm than good to the U.S. economy. So if wherever you live, if you pick up the phone and call your local college economics department, Republican, Democrat, you name it, they're going to say about the same thing. in all likelihood, is that trade is good for the United States. And really, what we learned during the Great Depression, where we increased tariffs for the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act, which raised U.S. tariffs dramatically high. It exacerbated the Great Depression. Other countries around the world put tariffs on U.S. exports. It wasn't just a U.S. problem, it was a global problem. And ever since then, whether you had a Democrat like Harry S. Truman or John F. Kennedy in office, or you had Dwight Eisenhower or Ronald Reagan in office, to some degree, they were trying to bring those tariffs down in the U.S. and abroad. Now the consensus, hopefully, in my opinion, just for the time being, has flip-flopped, and you have a bipartisan consensus, whether you're Joe Biden or Donald Trump, more in support of tariffs. And that's a big difference from the way things, the way leadership and trade policy has worked in the United States. And really, right up until about 2018 or so, foreign tariffs to U.S. exports have been falling. So I would view that policy since World War II as a big success, not only economically, but in bringing us closer to our friends and allies around the world.
I'm also in the Midwest, and I find it interesting when the politicians always say that free trade has decimated the Midwest. How do you respond to that criticism?
Well, a lot of times when they say that, they are talking about manufacturing. So the two things I would say in response to that, first of all, if you look at U.S. manufacturing output, it has never been higher. I say never been higher. Maybe it's tweaked down a little bit from last year to this year. But after NAFTA, after China joined the World Trade Organization, U.S. manufacturing output increased and continue to increase. So it's been a great success in terms of output. Now, what the critics will tell me is, what about jobs? We've lost manufacturing jobs as a result of international trade. But again, if you go back to 1994, when the North American Free Trade Agreement was enacted, if you go back to 2001, when China joined the World Trade Organization, and U.S. imports increased, and we had big trade deficits, but manufacturing unemployment rate, the unemployment rate for manufacturing workers trended down. It wasn't a straight line, but the manufacturing unemployment rate was trending down. It would go up when we would have a recession or a global pandemic. And the Department of Labor Statistics in the government looks at manufacturing layoff rates, and they found that manufacturing layoffs declined as well. So how do you square that? We have fewer manufacturing jobs compared to the total number of jobs in the economy, but fewer layoffs. And I think one answer, and the most direct answer, is a lot of times people found better jobs. We have a lot of us think of manufacturing jobs. We have this romantic view. A lot of the jobs really were if you're sitting in an assembly line in the 1950s doing the same task over and over for 8 or 10 hours a day, I don't know that we really want to bring back those kinds of jobs. Today, I think what's more important, the biggest challenging fact facing manufacturers today is often not that we don't have enough jobs, it's that we don't have enough qualified workers to fill those jobs. So people might disagree with me about what happened in the 80s and 90s, and we can talk about that, but I hope we could agree, looking at things today, that we need to have policies which make it easier to do business in the United States and to create more employment.
Great point.
What was Trump's? I mean, you said that Trump is using this 10% tariff policy as more of a tactic. Obviously, he's a great negotiator. He's done very well in his business life. But what were his previous in his first term? What was his tariff policy, and the impact of that on the business community or consumers? And how does that compare to this 10% that he's currently proposing?
Yeah, so that's a great question, because they're very different. The idea of a 10% across the board tariff on everybody and everything is a lot different than the actions he took during his first administration, which were more targeted in nature. And again, I wouldn't be surprised if he comes into office and we find that we have more tariffs But I suspect that they wouldn't be on every product from every country. A lot of the things we import, whether it's raw materials, whether it's machinery, there are parts and things that U.S. manufacturers and farmers need to produce goods in the United States. So the idea that we suddenly manufacturers and farmers are better off by putting tariffs on imports, some are better. So specifically, one of the things did was put tariffs on imported steel and aluminum. Well, if you produce steel or aluminum in the United States, that was a pretty good deal because you had less competition. You could raise prices. And it was a success in helping those specific industries, at least in the short term. But we have many more people who work in downstream industries who use steel or aluminum as an input, whether you're manufacturing boats, whether you're in construction, whether you're a farmer buying new farm implements and tractors. Those goods all cost more as a result. So the trade-off was you had a relatively small number of people in those steel and aluminum industries benefiting, but costs that were spread out throughout the economy. Those tariffs, by the way, by and large remain on the books. The Biden administration has tweaked them a little bit. We even apply those tariffs to Israel and other allies, which seems curious to me. Now, the other big tariff action under the Trump administration was to put tariffs on many imports that are supplied by China. They were called Section 301 tariffs. And Trump and his trade representative, Robert Lighthizer, and his trade advisor, Peter Navarro, said that we're going to put these tariffs in place to encourage and really nudge China to adopt policies that are going to be more favorable to us. And then we can take the tariffs off once they do that. The tariffs totally failed in that regard. So China has not gotten any better over the last 6 or 7 years. Anybody who's watched anything that China has done would probably tell you they've gotten a whole lot worse. So I think the track record shows that we ought to be cautious about using trade policy and tariffs to try and change China or any other country. The Biden administration this year had gone through a year-long analysis of what happened under those Section 301 tariffs, and they concluded that in many cases China's economic policies got worse instead of better, but they decided to maintain those tariffs, and they're actually expanding and putting even more tariffs on things like syringes and needles and medical gloves, things that I don't think are in any way, I don't think driving up the cost of healthcare items is a wise policy in the current environment. But if these are likely to go into effect in the next week or two, the Biden administration hasn't announced the final list of what exactly they're going to do. So then you just skip ahead to the presidential campaign. You have candidate Harris criticizing this plan that you pointed out for 10% tariffs on everything. But normally what would happen is you'd have a Republican candidate saying, your tariffs, Biden, are terrible. They're driving up costs. They're making it harder for Americans to do business. Instead, you've got almost each campaign trying to one-up each other to see who can out-tariff and out-protect the other. And that's something that could wind up having real costs on Americans. A lot of times also, you'd have candidates who would say one thing and they would get into office and their policies wouldn't reflect their campaign promises, or maybe their advisors would convince them that these policies weren't a good idea. We know from President Trump's 4 years in office that he's serious about this stuff, and for better or worse, he's probably going to follow through on some of these promises.
Theoretically, if you're a company and you're importing widgets, whatever it is, from China, and there's no place else to go, and there are targeted tariffs on China imported goods, that would essentially hurt you as a business because your costs are increasing. But if you're a company that has other options, other countries they could go to, and the tariffs are targeted to China, would that be helpful from a trade position with China to disincentivize importing from China and incentivize to other countries?
Sure, I think so, and I think there's certainly a short-term cost if you're going to be moving out of China. And I think a lot of companies would tell you that they already have a big incentive to move out of China. It's it's a communist dictatorship essentially. We could produce there, and it made sense if you're a business because they had a big internal market, because the cost of labor was so cheap, and the Chinese government was welcoming and encouraging that investment. That's not so much the case anymore. It's more expensive to produce there. You have a hostile government. So a lot of the big companies that chose to produce there in the past already have one foot out the door and are looking to produce in Vietnam or India or Latin America or alternatives. So in some cases, those tariffs could encourage that transition. For some products, I think, to me, there's a big difference between, say, high-tech semiconductors and that kind of trade. I'm not as concerned, and I don't think we as Americans should be as concerned if we buy a lot of toys and a lot of socks from China. I don't view those as national security risks, right? So should we diversify into other countries? I think absolutely. I think there's almost universal agreement that would be good. But the idea that everything we import is some kind of national security risk, I'm a little more skeptical of that. And the other thing is, if you're, say, a farmer or rancher, China remains our number one export market for those goods. So we need to think about what's in the interest, not just of certain U.S. industries, but our American producers who need those export markets. What I would like to see, in addition to the stick, is a little bit more of a carrot. And what I mean is, I think instead of putting a 10% tariff on our friends and allies, we ought to be dropping tariffs on our friends and allies to give people an even bigger incentive to move out of China and to move into other developing countries or even developed countries by making their goods more affordable instead of just only saying we want more tariffs on China. I run into advocates all the time here in the nation's capital who will say, we've got to get tough on China. We need big tariffs. And I'll respond, okay, well, I'll tell you what, let's have those tariffs as long as we cut tariffs on everybody else. And that's usually where they draw the line. So I think it's really important to not just read the headlines, but really look at the effect of some of these policies, who wins, who loses, and how they would affect the U.S. economy. And to me, I view trade with China different from overall trade. Just as during the Cold War, we had one set of policies dealing with the Soviet Union, totally different set of policies dealing with our allies. And there's no doubt, ever since the conclusion of World War II, our goal was to expand trade with our allies, to strengthen them, and to strengthen our relationships and to make us stronger. And I think that would be the best thing to do to help us counter China as well.
What about the argument about fair trade? So, for example, Canada has really strict limits on dairy imports from the U.S., basically allows virtually nil. Some of the USMCA that Trump negotiated overcame some of that, but it's still very unequal playing field. So what about that argument that says we need fair trade rather than free trade in that type of example?
I think there are two ways in general to address those kinds of problems, because there's no doubt that foreign countries have a lot of unfair barriers on U.S. exports. In the past, a lot of times we have tried to go in with unilateral tariffs and say, your policy's not fair. We're going to put tariffs on your good until you bring your tariffs down. A lot of times what that's done has had the opposite effect. We put tariffs on Canada, they get mad, they put more tariffs on us, we get mad, we put more tariffs on them, and it's a lose-lose type of situation. What has worked successfully since the 1990s is when we've had good trade agreements with other countries. And what I mean by good trade agreements is agreements that bring down both U.S. and foreign barriers. So if we tell Canada, we want you to bring down your barriers to our exports, and we're going to do the same and open up to you, it's more of a win-win type of approach. And I think it's also important to remember that while we point the finger at other countries for their unfair trade practices, and rightly so, we have lots of high tariffs of our own. So in the United States, we pay about twice the world price for sugar, for example. So if you're a sugarcane producer in Florida, that's a pretty good deal. And that's to a large extent the only reason we have these tariffs in place. But if you're a baker, if you're just an average American going to buy a candy bar at the grocery store or a box of cereal, or if you're a candy manufacturer, it's a very costly policy. So those tariffs, for example, what you've seen a lot of candy producers do is close down facilities in the United States and move to Canada or move to Mexico in order to get the sugar at the world price. So our tariffs, in other words, are self-destructive. So just because other countries might have bad policies, I don't think that automatically means we should have bad policies of our own. I'd rather have us focus on what can we do that's in our own interest, and dealing with other countries, try and engage in mutually beneficial trade agreements. We haven't done that in a long time. And in the meantime, Europe, Japan, other countries have been moving forward with free trade agreements of their own, and we've been left out on the sidelines. And that's we ought to be leading the parade, not bringing up the rear.
Yeah, I mean, I've always, when I get into these debates, because it has become an internecine debate now among conservatives, why can't we lead with reducing regulations and reducing taxes and making it easier for American small businesses to compete with global competition rather than using the hand of big government? But why do you? I mean, this is a hard question, but why do you think there's not more on the right making that argument that I just made, and now are using this big government response?
Well, first, I want to just say you just made a fantastic point, which is let's focus on having good tax policies. Let's focus on having good regulatory policies, good environmental policies, good labor policy. You go down the list that makes it easy to do business in the United States, that makes every country in the world, investors around the world, want to emulate us, that makes them want to invest in our country and create jobs here. And if we do that, I think a lot of these trade policy disputes will take care of themselves. All too often, we have costs imposed on Americans because of government policies, and it's all too easy sometimes to blame foreign countries for economic problems that maybe are created right here in Washington, D.C. So let's get our own house in order and focus on those kinds of policies that make us the best place in the world to do business. And to me, if you support low taxes, tariffs are just a tax, and they're a tax that hit low-income houses, the households the worst. So if you support low taxes, you ought to support lower trade barriers. Quotas that restrict sugar imports, that restrict imports of other goods, just drive up costs, and they're a regulation on doing business. So there's this disconnect between some conservatives, I think. They're all for free markets, and then it comes to trade policy, and all of a sudden they're like, oh, no, wait a minute. We want these protective tariffs and quotas. The twofold answer I have to your question about if economists think this is all a great idea, most businesses, depending on what you produce, would think trade is a great idea. We need the export markets. We need the inputs. Certain businesses that don't want to compete with foreign competitors would have a different view. Politically, that was a winning strategy. Look, that was Ronald Reagan's message when he was elected and then reelected in the biggest landslide election in my lifetime. So it's not like it's some message that Americans don't want to hear, but you have to have some leadership and knowledge and ability and willingness to make that case to Americans. When President Trump is your candidate and you're a Republican, and you might not be as concerned about trade policy, you just want a good president. And if your candidate says everybody in the world's ripping us off, yeah, everybody in the world is ripping us off. And if you look at the polls, the Cato Institute recently did an interesting poll where they asked people about trade. So if we put new trade barriers in place, would you support it or not? Republicans tended to support new trade barriers if the question said a Republican is putting them on, and to oppose the tariffs if the question said a Democrat was putting them on, and vice versa. So a little bit is you just follow whoever you trust exactly, and I think that's really what's part of what may be driving things. But as opposed to, I don't think a lot of people are like me, where they wake up every morning and they're thinking about what should our trade policy be, and Donald Trump probably wakes up every morning thinking about that as well. Most people are thinking about the normal things that we all think about every day, is getting their kids to school and paying their bills and all of that good stuff.
Well, Bryan, that's why I think this was such an important topic to have you come on and help us understand what tariffs are and how they really do impact us in our everyday life. Because you're right, we're not waking up thinking about trade policy every morning. But again, thank you so much for taking the time to join us on Main Street Matters, America's small business megaphone. Thank you all for taking the time to tune in and listen on this very important topic. Main Street Matters is part of the Salem Podcast Network. New episodes debut every Wednesday and Friday. You can subscribe to the show at salempodcastnetwork.com or wherever you get your podcast from, and we'll be back soon with another episode.